Welcome to Critical Conversations in Children's Literature, a web series I developed to bring children's literary writers in conversations with scholars to discuss critical topics brewing within the field. My name is Lashon Daley. I am an assistant professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University. My areas of research and teaching are focused on children's literature as it intersects with folktales and representations of girlhood in young adult novels. This series is funded by the Department of English and Comparative Literature at San Diego State University and is hosted in collaboration with the National Center for Study of Children's Literature. Today's episode acts as a part 2 to my conversation with middle grade author Tae Keller about her Newbery Award-winning novel, When You Trap a Tiger. When You Trap a Tiger centers the experience of a young Korean American female protagonist whose biracial identity fills her with longing for the stories of her family's past. For today's conversation, I have invited Dr. Charlene Tung, Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Sonoma State University, to provide insight into the historical and theoretical context of When You Trap a Tiger. Dr. Tung's interests include gender and globalization, Asian American women's history, contemporary immigration, and gender and race ethnicity in popular culture, as well as being able to teach women and gender studies to a younger generation throughout the K through 12 system. Thank you, Dr. Tung, for having this conversation with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I would love for you to start off by giving our audience some kind of overarching themes that intrigued you about When You Trap a Tiger and the experience of the protagonist.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I think I was really most interested in sort of the generational shifts that we see in this story, right? So that, well, that's like the first thing. So I'll just say that what's fascinating to me is the fact that we have sort of, not just 3 generations of coverage in this book, right? With Hominy, Joan, and then the 2 daughters. But we also have like this pointing toward Hominy's, mother and grandmother. So that's like, almost 5 generations of Korean and Korean American women all wrapped up into one middle grade novel. That's quite an amazing feat to me. So I would love to talk about that. But then there's also like these themes of silence and remembrance that I find really fascinating. And that's also, I think, tied to sort of the immigration, the migration histories. And then the final thing, like this, I love the sibling relationship that's sort of embedded in this novel as well. So those are some, like, say, 3 of the things that I think for me really stood out or sort of touched me.
So wonderful. So let's start actually with that last theme, because that's also something that struck me as well. And I would love to read just a couple of lines from page 125. And this is out of chapter 18, where Lily wants to set a tiger trap, right? And so she wants this to be an experience with her and her sister, Sam, yet she doesn't yet have that kind of intimacy built with her yet to be able to tell her what she's going to do. So instead, she decides to build it with Ricky, who's the neighborhood kid who also wants to befriend her. And so there's this couple of lines that say, "There's an ache in my chest because it should be Sam and me together building a tiger trap. This story belongs to sisters. It should be us." And so can you talk us through that experience of what you're saying in terms of how the sibling relationship affected you, but also thinking about this concept of sisterhood and what gets shared among sisters?
Yeah, I think what struck me between Lily and Sam is actually Lily, from the very beginning, like Lily's insight into Sam in this really interesting way about like Sam's sort of psychology that I found fascinating, even just from the moment like they get in the car together, and right, that opening scene where they're driving. She just captures the way Sam speaks and the sort of abruptness that she has, and like the kind of ways in which she sees Sam as so, well, frankly, different from her, and so abrupt and sort of pushing away a family history that I see Lily as like just reaching for so desperately. And part of that family history, I think, is reaching for Sam, right? Like trying to connect Sam and her mother and her hominy, all of them together, right? I don't know. There's just something fascinating about the way these two interact. And there's like as they're tweens and teens, that there's all these references that Lily makes to losing a connection to her sister as they get older, and clearly wanting to reconnect. And we don't really get a sense of how Sam sees this until quite further in, right?
Right.
Like toward the end, really, that we see Sam sort of reaching out, right? So, yeah, I don't. There's something very poignant to me about that separation that's happening between these two girls as they get older, and it seems to very much mirror, I think, like it seems very realistic to me to what happens between sisters in those middle school years through high school.
And is there something within your research that could perhaps help viewers think about this process in terms of stories and sisterhood or family connections, or what keeps families together, or even the concept, I know that you also think through how care works, right? And so we do have this understanding between the sisters that there's a lot of care going on. And perhaps for Sam, she feels that Lily doesn't care, and sometimes Lily feels that Sam doesn't care. So if you can maybe give us some context for how we can potentially understand care or familial relationships in context of this scene or of their relationship.
That's really interesting for me to think about, like care, because my work is on like care work, right? Care as labor. And usually across generations, as in terms of like the, like adults to the elders, right? So it's very interesting, this question, to think about it. What is care as emotional labor between siblings? I mean, that I actually really haven't thought about that. That's very interesting to me, to imagine the work that goes into maintaining like a sibling relationship and care for each other, and how they imagine it between themselves. I'm not actually sure about that. Have you thought about this between the siblings?
I have, because I am the youngest sister. And so, as a mother who was also an immigrant doing labor at other people's homes, thinking of my sister as my caregiver, automatic caregiver. But we do see in the book that Joan does come back to take care of her mother. And so that there's all of these layers of care, and especially the girls thinking that they have to then take care of their mom. So, and then Harmony saying, you don't have to take care of me, right?
Yeah.
I live here. This is my space. So
Mhm.
those are all the ways I feel like care has become very complex as a result of these layers of the generations that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, right. The distance, the crossing of all these borders, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that the care work that I see happening in this novel, definitely it becomes very obvious to me with regard to the elder care that's happening, right? And Joan moving her entire family, like uprooting them to go to this small town in Washington State to take care of her dying mother. Not That seems to me very much like it's like an Asian American cultural practice. I do see that. I mean, I see it across various other communities as well, particularly when they have immigrant elders. I see that still happening. So in that way, I see this aspect of the novel very much as, to be even more specific, let's say it's a Korean American sort of practice, but I think Asian American cultural practice in general, this idea that you're going to care for your elders. And I think also it's a function, frankly, of the United States' complete inability to have any kind of institutionalized care settings that are kind and compassionate, I should say, for our elders in the United States. So it's both, it's both sort of a cultural practice that's crossed borders, and it's a necessity too, I think, particularly with those of us who have immigrant parents, right? To either bring them into your home, or in this case, with like we see in this book, Joan taking her children and moving over there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the fact that the kids don't, not only they not know what's going on initially, but they can't fathom that this is actually happening initially, that this would happen to them, that they're going to be moved. And then the reason is because of their ailing grandmother. But then you see sort of this immediate, right, with Lily, like, I'm going to save her, right? So like this sort of notion, like these little, like, I don't know, threads of filial piety are like, intertwining all the way through these generations. And I don't mean that in any kind of romanticized way. I think a lot of this is also in the book is a kind of a necessity, yeah. yeah, I definitely don't want to sort of essentialize that this is some sort of Asian,
Yeah.
like, like, oh, because they're Asians and they're just like so, family is so important, right? It's not quite as, I think, simple as that. But
Right, right. And it gets to be really complicated in how you also mentioned that the information doesn't get passed down. So the girls, Lily and Sam, don't realize that their mother has uprooted them in order to care for their grandmother. Rather, it's just kind of an immediate uprooting. They all of a sudden are showing up at their hominy's house, and they're still really left in the dark for a good majority of those first couple of chapters. And perhaps we can also think about, like, why wasn't the information passed down? Some of the conversations that we've been having in our class is this concept in terms of girlhood, of leaving out important information for the girls to be able to make their own choices. And so one of the conversations that some of my students were having is, why don't we tell girls the truth? Why, perhaps as parental beings, we choose to remove that agency from the girls so that they're not harmed, but really the lack of information brings a lot of harm. And so I'm just wondering if you had any insight into, I don't know, perhaps this concept around how we can understand girlhood and this wanting to give them agency, especially as, me as a girlhood scholar being like, no, girls should have agency. But where does that agency lie when it comes to parental understanding and care, but that care leads to harm?
yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Really interesting about, the dichotomy or sort of the, oh gosh, right, that sort of protective nature of care, right? Um, but when that crosses a line to become actually harmful, right? That, like you said, the taking away of the agency. When I think about Lily and Sam and Joan and Hominy, and then the two generations beyond that, earlier than that, I mean, it's just this long line of silencing and silence, right? I mean, not like yeah, no, I think it is. It's a conscious silencing, right? Of choosing what histories and stories not to tell, and what that ends up doing. I think, like, if you look at these women all the way down, you see this, right? And actually Lily sees it. She sees the, oh wait, like Homony's mother fled, right? And left Homony's left, and then Homony left, right? Looking for her mother. And then Joan left, right? And then you've got, and everybody's sort of seeking to escape, right? From untold histories, really, right? The fear of some sort of untold history or stories that they're so that are so painful, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that is such a central part of this book, that very much struck me, and the perseverance of all the women in this story, that in spite of the lack of knowledge, right? Like, of what you would think would sustain them, right? Like, in an ideal world, like the histories would sustain them, right? They would see, what have we overcome to be here in this moment. They don't know that, and yet they're still, like, you see these generations of women still persevering, still creating their lives, still creating meaning. And it's also, frankly, this is a story of single mothers too that we're seeing in particular, right?
I didn't think about that either, to the generation of single mothers taking care and also trying to provide for their
Yeah.
children. It was
And
interesting thinking, oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, and you're right, and not telling their stories to their children.
When I was talking to Tae Keller, particularly about this book, and it as an opportunity for her to tell her family story, which I thought was so brilliant, because also as writers, we tend to want to archive our family stories. So it was interesting that those stories weren't told within the characters, but yet we have the kind of irony of Tae Keller choosing to tell the story of that silence as a part of her way of kind of archiving that those stories existed. So I thought it was just kind of a really brilliant way for her to not only bring forth the folk tales of her culture, but also this history of silencing, but breaking that silence,
Breaking that
right?
silence, right, through Lily, right? And yeah, I mean, you know much more about the folk tales, but what I loved about that aspect in this book was right, like it is sort of loosely based on Tae Keller, right? Like I mean, it's her, like she's biracial too, right? And she's got this character, these two characters in there that are biracial and bicultural, and she's taken like traditional quote unquote Korean folk tales, like the first one, and then she is like reimagining it, right, in the second and third tale that gets revealed in the book, right? And to me, that's like it's such a great reflection on how it is that stories obviously change and shift through generations, but also just how you go from like an immigrant generation to a Joan who's a 1.5 generation actually to the two kids who are second generation, and how culture shifts and changes, right? So the folktale becomes this vehicle through which you see that as well, right? And it becomes this more honest reflection because it's changed, right? It's shifted and changed over time and generation. It becomes an honest reflection of what that might be like for, I think, for a biracial child or a second generation immigrant, or I mean, second generation child of immigrants, right?
Of immigrants, right?
Yeah.
And even
Yeah.
thinking about that too, in terms of change, is that moment when she wants to make the rice cakes, but she uses, I think, peanut butter and jelly, or maybe it's just jelly instead.
Yeah, jam, yeah.
Jam.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, that is, even for me, when my mother passed away, and thinking about the various recipes of what she cooked and how I've had to change them as a result of not knowing exactly how things are made, but then it becomes a kind of new way for me to experience my own culture. It doesn't make it a bad thing. It just makes it something different.
Exactly, right. It's not less than, and it's not necessarily losing one's culture either. It's right that I think what often happens is when we think about culture, we think about it as some kind of static notion, right? As if it wasn't changing itself over time, like whatever Korean culture is or was, right, has changed over the generations, just as it has for Korean Americans, right? And that was something that about the care work that really struck me too, that when I think about elder care in the United States, I was referencing earlier how we don't have in the US a very good structure for that, or a tradition necessarily of elder care in the same kinds of ways that traditionally, I mean this traditionally, and other Asian countries, right? So it reminded me of so for example, my mom lives with me, but when I was talking to her about her parents, right? So my grandparents, whom I didn't really know because they lived, they lived their entire lives in Taiwan. When my grandfather on my mom's side became ill or was not able to take care of himself, the kids actually put him in a home, like a retirement home. But there were 12 kids, Lashon. Not a single one of them, right? And this is my mom's generation of kids, right? So this isn't like I would have thought, oh, I could see in my generation, they would be like, okay, we're done with that tradition. Like we're busy, whatever, right? But I was stunned to hear that. And she said, yeah, that was the first generation or time that they were creating a lot of these like retirement homes in Taiwan. So that's what it means, sort of like these notions of filial piety and caring for our elders on the one hand is like an Asian American cultural practice, and in another hand, it's not even an Asian cultural practice anymore in some places, right? It's not a static thing, right?
Yeah. And that was another criticism that came up in class was, why would Joan leave her life to go care for her mother? And it was so funny. And I didn't tell, my students that my mother had passed away, and that in the midst of grad school, I actually left grad school to go take care of my mother, during her last phase of life. And it was interesting because there's this expectation that, well, she has daughters to take care of, and at the risk of not being able to care for her daughter, she chose to care for her mother. And then, we see kind of everything spiral out of control, but there sometimes is a priority. You have to kind of care less for something in order to care more for others. But it is interesting, and thinking of this notion of what's traditional kinds of care. Yeah. Perhaps putting a parent in a facility where there could be constant 24 care, or the care that seems more appropriate or maybe romanticized is for a child to take care of their parent, but knowing that there are some really other complexities that prevent you from doing that care well. Right?
Yes. Oh, yes, definitely. I totally hear you on that. I also, when my dad was sick, I live in California. My parents used to live in Florida. And I had two babies at the time when my dad became ill. And it was hard, flying back and forth and really trying to like putting my parents first over my young children. And thankfully, right, I had a partner who was very much able and willing, obviously, to care for these little ones. But yeah, the ways in which I did and I do feel a connection to this practice of caring for your elders in the sense that they, as a return for what they have done for you, right? And I think this is, for me in particular, like, and a lot of, I think, those of us with immigrant parents, we're aware of how much they gave up, right? So there's a sense of, okay, no, now, of course I'm going to be here for you, right? I do think that happens. But like I said, it's not happening in Taiwan anymore. So I don't know, like what to make of that is
it's complex, but I'm grateful to see that that's taken up in the book in such a way for us to be able to have conversations about what does it mean to care for an elder? What does it mean to care for your children? And what kind of responsibility, especially for Joan, does she have on both of these ends to say, this is what I'm going to do. This is
right.
And obviously my students were very, very judgy about her.
Really,
her
that's
desire.
Fascinating to me. It would never even occur to me that people would be judging her. That's fascinating. I mean, it makes sense that you raise it. I want to teach this book to my college students in my YA literature course this next spring, and I'll be interested in where they go with that.
Bring up. Yeah. So one of the other things, and you and I talked about this briefly before we started recording, was the character of Ricky, and I would just love to have your insight into Ricky's character, and then also kind of think about my own criticism about Ricky and why I am unclear about his role in the story. But you also talked about partnership, right? Briefly thinking about your partner, and we can see Ricky as Lily's partner in this adventure that they're going on. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting because I hadn't thought so much about Ricky. Like he was like kind of a blip in my, like in terms of, I pretty much overlooked Ricky. I think, quite frankly, I was so much more wrapped up in the generational aspects of what was going on here. And the fact that they were, mixed race Asians. Like I was really into all of that. And their experience in this like predominantly white small town, right? Even Harmony, like I think I was really just trying to imagine her as this single Korean mother in that generation living in a small town in Washington state. Like what? I don't even I can't even figure that out. Like just like why and how. So Ricky became like this blip, but now you made me sort of think about him, right? I was like, I mean, in terms of like why he's even in the book, I mean, like there's a question about that. I think you're right. And like, why couldn't Ricky have been, for example, another female? I get why he's white. I mean, that's where the town they're in, but why a little boy in particular, right? To become her like touchstone.
And why not Jensen?
Why not
I just
Jensen,
feel like
right?
we have the perfect opportunity to have this girlhood trio just come in and just take over the adventure. But yet we watched Ricky play that role. And I just find it a missed opportunity, especially because I'm thinking about how girls play essential roles in these novels. And so maybe it's my own bias that I'm constantly thinking about how to empower the girl, and when I see that opportunity being missed, it evokes emotion in me.
I totally hear you. I mean, I think you're right. I have this way of thinking of like Jensen and Sam as off on their own in this sort of really interesting way to me. But when you said, oh, what about this trio of girls? I was like, yes, now that would have been a really fascinating direction. And it would have brought the girls together again, the two sisters, right? In a shared kind of adventure and a way to interweave them back together because they're feeling so much distance. All right, there's your story, right? Did you ask Tae about it?
I didn't bring, we did talk about Ricky a little bit. I didn't come clean with how I would have liked for her to rewrite the text, but she did acknowledge that perhaps in real life, there would have been more time for the sisters to come together as they age. It's just, unfortunately, the context of the book and the time in which they are,
Yeah.
that connection doesn't happen. Because I did ask her about the apology in the very end, which felt very lackluster for me because it really destroyed Lily's self-esteem in a lot of ways. And so to have this, what felt like a very simple apology for me wasn't satisfying. Again, younger sister, I want all of your sins to be listed out. And I felt that apology could have been at least a chapter. And so one of her response was, perhaps in real life, it could have had more time. They would have had more time. But in this, it was just, that's where the apology started.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, did I want more from Sam? I don't know if I didn't know if I felt, maybe it's this. I didn't feel like Sam could give more. There was a way in which I felt like, and maybe this is just my read on it, that there was like, in terms of like, you think about like diverse books, right? So all these characters, and there's a queer character, and I actually thought that there was maybe some neurodivergence actually going on with regard to Sam and or to Lily. Like, I mean, Lily, maybe it's more obvious because she talks about like, oh, I can't get along with people, or I'm not a sticky person, right? But there's something about the way in which, I'm thinking about it now, like I have probably pulled them out, but there were like certain excerpts about Sam that made me think, or like, she can't go there. She can't go to this emotional space. And it may just be because of loss of her dad and just loss and grief in general. But also I sort of had this sort of moments where I thought, no, maybe this is just like how she operates, like, moves through the world in a way that she isn't emotionally necessarily connecting the way that Lily really does and wants to, right? Like she wants to connect with people. And I don't know, does Sam want to? I don't know.
Yeah, and we haven't touched upon the fact that the book starts off in grief in a very strong way, right? We find out early on that they lost their dad in a very tragic space or through a very tragic accident, and also thinking about how that grief doesn't get dealt with, and it's just like sitting on their chest throughout this entire text. And so how you were saying how it could be really hard for Sam to even get there because there's so much to even uproot before she could even see the grief that she's causing her sister.
Oh yeah, right. I mean, she's in the midst of so much, I think, in some ways, self-harm that she can't even begin to see, oh, am I impacting you? Right. Like, so like not telling any, like that it isn't until the very end that you realize, oh, Sam has never told stories about her dad to her younger sister, right? And they're only 3 years apart, right? So, and not realizing that in so doing, right, she'd kept there's a big hole for Lily as well because of that. So psychologically I understand why she did that, but I don't think she knew, like you said, the harm she was actually then, sharing with Lily, right? And even and then like, when I read it again, trying to pick out like the histories in here, right? That there's just like all like just, I don't know, interwoven in. I mean, then you, I don't know. The first time I read it, I almost didn't catch. I don't think I fully caught that Homini's mom was like disappeared, like came over to the United States and disappeared. Like, what? Again, what? Like, what happened there, right? And what that must have been like for Homini, right?
Right. Yeah. It's true. That's one of the things that I didn't take into full context. Again, that perhaps sense of abandonment, that is probably Joan felt it at the passing of her husband. The girls felt it at the passing of their father. So there is, that theme of abandonment that just perhaps comes up in a lot of us as we experience death of those who are close to us. One of the other things I wanted to consider going back to Lily and Sam and their relationship is Sam's relationship to Jensen and how it never gets told to Lily. And perhaps I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that and how that ended up being represented in the text.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was this sort of treatment of Sam and Jensen is well done for a middle school novel for which Sam was not the main character. So it felt somewhat realistic that Lily had, quote unquote, no idea, in part because the focus is, Lily's focus also is on her grandmother dying and trying to save her grandmother. And Sam is like sort of passing along, along the edges there. And, when I think about youth at that age, and actually they're the exact same ages as my own daughters. I think they're like 15 and 12, or 16 and 13. They aren't sharing with each other in the way they used to, right? And it's the older one really that's pulling away, because, the circle of friends and things like that. So that part didn't. That part kind of rang true to me, that Lily wouldn't know that this is happening, because they're not. They've separated. They've been separating, right? And then, yeah. I mean,
That's true. That's true. I didn't think about it in that sense. I just thought, oh no, they should have a conversation. They should sit down. But again, I'm forgetting what it was like for me and my sister, who are only 2 years apart, and when that distance was created, why it was created, and then eventually that gap gets smaller for some sisters. But.
Yeah, I do. I think that's true. I think it's oftentimes, college age and after, right? That some of that comes back around. And sure, so I think some siblings obviously stay close all the way through high school, but I think it is a stage that, and I think, with these two girls, Sam and Lily, just the 3-year gap means like one's in high school and one's in middle school, and that's kind of like a different world until it's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have, had more of Sam and Jensen. That's definitely the case. I would have liked that. Because it's really all on the periphery and you don't really hear anything about it, So, but it's one book, so.
It's true. It is one book, and it's from Lily's perspective. And I think that is the mark of a great book, right? When there are other people and other characters that you really want to get involved in, because you know that they have a full story elsewhere. That was also something that Tae Keller mentioned, that Jensen had a life. She was rooted in that community. She had things going on for herself. And as a result of that, we see glimpses of it. But I think that's also why Jensen and Sam are strong characters, is because we want more. We want more time with them. And again, why I would ask for the re-edit is so that I do get more time with Sam and Jensen and Lily.
Yeah.
That I could, process their experience a little more.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely. It also makes me think about, like, I would like to know more about Harmony growing up and her transition to the United States. Like, because I'm assuming, because she came over with Joan as a young child, right? Like, yeah, I'm fascinated by that. Like, what was that like? I would love to know. I would love that story too.
Part two. From Harmony's,
right, from her perspective, right?
Yeah,
totally.
That is, I mean, again, such a great novel. So many of my students were acknowledging that this is their favorite book that they read in college. So I was very proud.
Oh my gosh.
of being able to add this text to our course and have these really significant conversations with them. And so I'm wondering if there's any kind of final insights you would like to provide the viewers about this text, or even perhaps your insight into diverse books, or even as someone who is both an avid reader of young adult novels and also a scholar of young adult novels. Like, what do you think we can take away from this text, or perhaps other texts like this that are, Newbery Award winning?
Oh, yeah.
And for those who haven't yet, won an award.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I love about this book, really, I mean, I see it as an Asian American YA novel, right? For middle grade students, quintessentially so, right? Because of the sort of Asian American history that's woven in, that you could, if you assign the book in a college classroom, right, you could then delve into like Korean history and Korean American history. And those are histories we just don't teach in the United States, typically K through 12, or even in frankly, in college, right? Like Asian American history is not very well known. And so I love the contributions that the potential this book has to do that and open up, that knowledge to so many folks that would never get it otherwise. And then also just that the reflection for Korean Americans and for Asian Americans, and for biracial Asian Americans, right? That they could see themselves reflected, through the language, through some of the traditions, right? And really yeah, I mean, I remember thinking when I read the description of this book and started to look into it before I actually read the book, that there was so much talk about it being like around a Korean folktale. And to be quite honest, that didn't actually grab me. Like when you asked me if I'd read it, I was like, no, I've seen it. Like I've walked past it, like in the bookstore. And it was because I thought, oh, well, I thought like as an Asian American, it wasn't going to connect to me because I'm like, well, it's a Korean folktale. And then I realized, no, it's not actually, right? Like this is actually the reimagining of it largely within this context here in the United States. And it actually reminded me of how, what's the name of that film? Minari was mistakenly put under like the foreign film category. I feel like the marketing somewhat of this book has been like, oh, it's like a Korean folktale come to life. It's like, actually, no, it's a Korean American folktale come to life in some ways. Like that's to me what this book is. And I don't think it's just specific for Asian Americans. I think, anyone who has like a more recent immigrant history would find so much resonance in this book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such great insight. I didn't think about that just in terms of marketing or how a book is categorized. And my students and I have read the past couple of Newbery winners that feature female protagonists. We reread Mercy Suarez Changes Gears by Meg Medina, and then we just finished The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. And so we're thinking of how these kind of books resonate with one another, but also what kind of stories are they telling about girlhood, but specifically about like the othered girl, right? So we have this Korean American experience, and then we have Mercy Suarez experience being a part of a Cuban family, and then we have the kind of wizardry as a result of The Girl Who Drank the Moon. And so, yeah, it is interesting how these kind of other perspectives that are very much needed are marketed and seen, but also doing really well in an industry that has unfortunately not always privileged these kinds of stories.
Yeah. I mean, the proliferation has been, of diverse books, right? And the We Need Diverse Books, the whole like movement, has been just, it's phenomenal, frankly. None of this existed when I was, coming of age. So to see this now, it's why I read them, frankly. It's for my own fun. I'm loving that. Plus then, intellectually digging into all of it. And
of course. Yeah. Well, thank you for intellectually digging into When You Tap a Tiger with me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Great conversation. I hope to have you again soon.
Yeah, definitely.